were once individual contributors and then moving into management roles, I always ask them to think about the best managers you've had and the absolute nightmare managers that you had. What were the qualities that you appreciated? What were the times when you received the best feedback and you felt empowered after to make a change versus when did you feel disempowered? Welcome to another episode of the Your Next Move podcast. Today, we are talking about something super important. We are talking about feedback and how to give it and receive it both laterally and horizontally. We all know communication is essential, but there are some basic steps in giving constructive feedback that are key. So I want to kick the episode out with this. Make sure you have your pen and paper out because feedback is something that is one of the most crucial things that you need to be able to give and receive in the workplace, but also probably the number one thing most people are afraid to give and receive in the workplace. So 4 steps: ask, explain, share, request. Number 1, ask if you can give the feedback. Ask if you have permission to give the feedback. Now, I know this may feel like a rhetorical question. If your manager is asking, do you mind if I give you some feedback on that? You can't be like, yeah, nah, I don't want to hear it. I thought I did great. I'm amazing, and walk away. But it's always nice to invite someone to the conversation. It's not that you can necessarily decline it, but you could say, do you mind if we talk about this at the end of the day? I'd love to have a little bit more dedicated time. Ask just to make sure that the surrounding is okay to give feedback in this time. Or maybe the person wants to have it by themselves. They want to be one-on-one in an office, not off-site right after a presentation where people are walking by. Always ask for permission. Is it right if I give you some feedback on this? 2 was explain. Explain the specifics you are giving feedback on. Make sure that your feedback is not general. Many times we can be so nervous about giving feedback that we make it so general, there's no action afterwards. It has to be super duper clear. And that's why the 3rd one is share, where we want you to give a specific example and the result that occurred as a direct result of that person's actions. Because you did A, B happened, and now we have to do C. Make sure there's an example so someone can understand how can they replicate this if it is positive feedback, or how can they avoid it if it's constructive feedback. We need that example in there. And last but not least, make the request to resolve the matter. What is the next step in order to make sure this does not happen again? So ask if you can give it. Explain, give the specifics about what's happening, what the feedback is about. Share an example of the feedback and request to resolve the matter. And this can go for both positive or constructive feedback because we all love positive feedback as well, just as much as we need people to course correct their actions when they're not aligned with what's happening in the organization. We also need to give people their kudos and let them know they're doing a really great job. Many times there are high performers in the workplace who leave just because they feel that they are undervalued and unappreciated and no one has ever told them that they're doing a good job. Practice giving feedback in both scenarios. This will help inspire productivity and also grow your own confidence muscle, especially for those managers listening, to make sure that you know how to do this. The 2 main forms of communication I want to dive deeper into today are vertical and lateral, which can also be called horizontal. You can gather that this means whether it's up or down or left to right, but it's important that you understand both of these different communication norms when we're thinking about giving feedback. We need to know the difference, the pros and cons, so that we can then better communicate work. So let's start with vertical communication. So vertical communication is when we're talking about that hierarchy structure, which means top to bottom or bottom to top. This works best in organizations that have a clear hierarchical structure. So many companies have a chain of command, you may hear them say. Or when I'm doing consulting agreements, I break out my programming by the level of hierarchy in an organization. What we do for analysts and coordinators is different from managers and senior managers, from directors to VPs to chiefs, etc. In order to do vertical communication, the hierarchy structure has to be really, really clear. so that things can easily flow up or down throughout the chain of command through the various roles, and the message is translated in the way that it needs to be. And when we're thinking about communicating, if we go one step deeper into vertical communication, the four main types are research, instructions, performance, and memos. So sometimes we're communicating things that are data-based. So analytics, that we need to assess the information that needs to be floated upward or downward. Upward to allow people to know what's been happening, and generally downward to inform how work is going to change. Instructions are a little bit similar to that, and that this is typically when we're talking about project management. So you're sharing information to assign to tasks. This is generally when we're talking about top down. Performance reports, and we have another episode on this where we talk about performance reviews, is where we're generally doing these on an annual or semi-annual basis, and the employees are overseeing this. In organizations that have a 360 process, which I love, it's so important to get that 360 feedback. Many don't have it yet. But for organizations that do have it, it's super important to have this type of vertical communication so that you know what's happening in your role at the company, how you can improve or how you can continue to position yourself for career acceleration. And last but not least are more memos. And that's generally not even a formal communication that is more spoken. This is more of a written communication, maybe a company email or a newsletter, and you can pass it through several different folks. So vertical communication, one of the benefits is that it's fairly transparent in terms of a chain of command. We know how it's supposed to go. We know who to contact, whether it's for positive things or for grievances. And they're generally, the communication channels are well defined and they're super strong. There's also a respect for boundaries in knowing that who gets what information when, because that structure is there. And there can be open communication amongst people at the various levels when you're going to work toward whatever the initiative is. On the other side, though, there are some disadvantages, and sometimes that can be a slow timeline. When there are so many approval systems and a hierarchical structure, there's sign-offs and different things that need to happen in order to make sure that things are conveyed in a certain way. It can definitely slow things down. I've personally worked in a lot of organizations that had really strong hierarchical structures, and it can be very hard to finally get the approval to do the thing or get the feedback on whatever it is, because it has to go through this person and then this person and then this person, and this person signs off. And then we go back down the ladder step by step, and you can't skip the steps. Some employees, many times you'll identify with feeling like your creativity is stifled because you need so many approvals to go through. And there could be a power imbalance as well, where you feel like things are always coming from the top down versus the bottom up. And last but not least, sometimes it could be a little bit of misinformation, because when you've been playing telephone, when it goes through so many people, the message can be distorted by the time it gets to you, whether you're at the top or at the bottom. So when we're talking about this vertical communication and we're giving feedback, we're just communicating in general in the workplace within a hierarchical structure, it's important that you have a few key tips to be successful. So one are clear deadlines. Make sure that there are deadlines that are clearly communicated at every step of the way so things don't get caught. Many times when there are multiple approval systems, it's easy for something to get stuck because there's no urgency and no one knows when it's supposed to get done. It's also key that there are regular meetings from the bottom up and the top down to make sure that everyone is building a community where there is a sense of trust and transparency. Make sure there's opportunities for different people to speak. One of the bad things about a hierarchy structure is that many times folks who are at the lower end feel like they're never seen, they're never heard. It's important that there's connectivity across different levels, and we're not waiting based upon a title. And last but not least is a second nod to transparency. Transparency is key. And one of the last organizations I worked with, we were talking about core values that needed to happen within the organization, and radical transparency is one of the core values that we really push forward for, because so many times it can feel like things are happening to you versus with you. And when you have open communication, radical transparency helps bring everyone along the journey. Even if the feedback you're sharing, if the new initiative that's happening, if there's some change management, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's reaction is going to be good, and that's okay. But what's important is that people are in the know. So next up, if we move to lateral communication, this takes place amongst people who are at the same level in the same department or division. It's really an exchange of information that can feel much more equal. And there's two main forms of horizontal, or we could say lateral communication, that we like to chat about. And generally, the methods are whether it's oral or whether it's written. So oral, we're talking about phone calls, speeches, video calls, face-to-face, and written could be media, emails, letters, applications, a healthy combination of all of the ones here. So the benefits of horizontal communication, generally it provides so much flexibility. We talk about this a lot of times in startup culture, where startups don't want to create the hierarchy structures that were in other companies they've been at, most likely larger companies. They want everyone to be able to speak to whoever they need whenever they need it. And there's not this taboo of, oh, I can't talk to the VP, I need to talk to the director, and the director will talk to the VP. They don't want any of that. They want it to be more of a group tank where people are able to speak and facilitate problem solving, information sharing, and more task coordination between departments and projects teams. There's essentially no lines that are separating individuals in the workplace. It is most essential that it really provides a higher quality interaction and team camaraderie. When we talk about disadvantages, sometimes this can breed a little bit of competitiveness amongst coworkers, because if there's not a hierarchy structure and everyone is kind of doing what they want to do, talking to who they want to, sometimes you could see poor communication or toxic workplace behaviors, and people feel like they have to beat someone to the punch. They may feel like, well, let me withhold this information so this other person doesn't know and can't go ahead and race ahead and get that there. And sometimes a silo can be formed when someone decides that they're going to separate themselves from the unit in order to hold back information. This also creates a little bit more of a territory mindset where people feel like they need to hold everything so that no one else can catch up to where they are, which means that it can feel chaotic. According to Lisa Brown, HR expert at the HR Collaborative, lateral communication suffers when there's a lack of consensus on the priority, timing, and roles in communication within the organization. We've gone over so many of the pros and cons of communication, whether we're talking lateral or horizontal. And we talked about the benefits, whether it's flexibility, transparency, efficiency, creativity. And we know the downsides, whether it's potential competitiveness, chaos, or lack of authority. But we want to end today by talking about what you can do to work on some of your own communication. So number one is understanding your workplace culture. How does your organization function? What are the norms? One of my favorite guests on the podcast, Jasmine Bland Hawthorne, she always talks about asking for forgiveness versus permission. So I say this also in that just because you understand the norms of the organization, you have to decide, is this a norm that you'd like to follow? Or is it a norm where you want to shake the boat and do something a little bit different? But what's important is that you understand how the organization generally runs when we're talking about feedback and talking about communication styles across the organization. If you have the opportunity to, especially for the HR reps who may be listening, it may be time to perform a lateral communication survey and understand, how are things perceived in the organization? Are people receiving feedback? Do they feel like they're left out of the loop? What can you do to really create a culture of feedback, a culture where communication is something that is valued throughout the organization? And last but not least, again, for those HR folks, it's important to think about how you can make things more uniform. Can you standardize best practices across the organization? This is key. And in really and truly understanding what communication style is best for you and for your team. Every business is different, and there are amazing startups who are embracing horizontal communication structures, but it doesn't mean that that's necessarily the right choice for you. You need to choose a route that works for you, works for your organization, and also we're going to double down on has that radical transparency. So I have a few questions that I want to circle back to you. Circle back, I know that sounds very corporate. I know folks make fun of that on Instagram, but I still say circle back all the time. Sometimes feedback needs to be communicated through several different channels. So I want you to ask yourself these questions when providing feedback. Does the feedback need to be anonymous, or does it need to be attributed to an individual? Not every piece of feedback has to be attributed to the person. It can be generalized feedback. We want specific examples, but doesn't necessarily need to be attributed. Doesn't need to be addressed in an individual basis or as a group. Again, with feedback, how it's delivered is a huge part of how it's going to be received. Does it need to come face to face, or does it need to be written? Especially when we're starting to talk about performance management or formal complaints, sometimes you can have a face-to-face or verbal conversation, but it needs to be followed up with something written to make it formalized and documented. Does the situation require a vertical approach or a lateral approach? It really depends on the type of feedback that you're giving. How will this employee benefit the most from the channel of feedback that this is coming in on? When delivering feedback, in order for it to be received, we have to think about the intention in which we're providing that person feedback. How is this going to help them excel? How is this going to help them improve? How is their performance after this feedback going to change, for better or for worse? And last but not least, do they need it to come from above or below? Or is it best to come from someone in their own community or level at the company? When we're thinking about feedback, again, we need to think about compassion. When we talked earlier this season about compassion in the workplace as being a core value, especially when you're giving constructive feedback, it is crucial you're thinking compassionately about how this will be received. Earlier on in my career, I had an employee who was phenomenal. Best hire in the entire world. If she's listening, she knows exactly who she is, and that I cannot wait to steal her to bring her to work at Manifest Yourself. Amazing employee. But I knew in our interactions, she was such a high performer, and she was definitely the definition of a perfectionist in the workplace. Her mistakes were few and far between. But when she did make mistakes and feedback did need to be provided, I was very cognizant of when and how I delivered it to her. One of the things I do at my company when someone gets hired, or when I worked in corporate America, I would give my team a working styles quiz. And one of my favorite questions to ask was, how do you like to receive feedback? What time of day do you like to receive feedback? What is a common misconception that I will feel after giving you constructive feedback based upon your reaction? And one of the things I learned about her specifically was feedback was best delivered at the end of the day. Ideally on a Friday, because she was someone who would immediately beat up on herself for whatever the mistake was. Even if nothing was in her control, giving her feedback in the morning would ruin the entire day and her productivity. So if I gave it on a Friday and she had the weekend to think about it, she'd come back bright-eyed and bushy-tailed on a Monday morning, and it was amazing. Now, many times when I teach workshops and we have a mix of different generations, we'll have our baby boomers and our Gen Xers say, sometimes I gotta say what I gotta say when I gotta say it, and they gotta take it. And our Gen Zs and our millennials will say, is it really that hard to wait till the end of the day? What I share here is that this is in the most ideal situation. If you are able to control the environment in which you are giving feedback, if you are able to give feedback in a way that the person receiving it will have the most positive experience possible, why wouldn't we just go for that? We understand that sometimes that can't happen. Sometimes feedback has to happen in the moment and be corrected. But imagine the connection, the relationship that is built when you just take a little extra moment to consider how this feedback will be received. And I think, especially as we're talking about growing in the workforce and we see folks who were once individual contributors and then moving into management roles, I always ask them to think about the best managers you've had and the absolute nightmare managers that you had. What were the qualities that you appreciated? What were the times when you received the best feedback and you felt empowered after to make a change versus when did you feel disempowered? I remember one time early in my career, I'm trying to make sure I don't give too many details because I know the person. She's a mentor of mine now and I love her, but she came from a very strong political background. So if you've ever watched, I just watched The Diplomat on Netflix, amazing show if you haven't watched it, and you think about that culture, that war room culture, people yell, they curse, like that's just how it is sometimes in politics, at least how we see it on TV, right? She worked in politics in real life. So I remember she gave me feedback one time and it was in front of the entire team and it was very strongly worded. me and my Cancer self, where I am very empathetic. You may not see me cry, but I'm gonna cry later. I'm sensitive. Let me just say, I am sensitive. That did not go well with me in any way, shape, or form. And I remember after she gave the feedback, since we were on a group call, I was like, well, you know what? I think you need to know that I really didn't appreciate you calling me out. It made me feel like an asshole. And I said it on the call because she delivered feedback in a very similar way. And she was like, oh, really? I said, yeah, it makes me not want to work here. And we had a very healthy communication after that about what it looked like, what was best, what wasn't good. And we had a conversation after without the whole team involved, which was much better. But I think about moments like that. So when I give feedback, I always ask, like, some people are fine. Like, call me out in front of the whole team. It's fine. Other people like me, bring me into the room. Tell me where I made the mistake by myself. You don't need to tell me in front of the whole entire free world, because it's automatically going to make me defensive, feel called out, feel disrespected, because it's not something the whole team necessarily needs to hear. Think about those moments when you received the best feedback and when you had moments like what I experienced and what your reaction was. And let's try to not create and recreate the situations we've had in our careers that were negative. The way we communicate with each other matters. The channels in which we receive and give it and other information can have a monumental impact on someone's experience in the workplace. If you have more questions about feedback, I invite you to write in. Feedback is a topic that we do a lot of training on at Manifest Yourself, and I would love to assist you and your teams in any way, shape, or form. So please feel free to write to podcast@manifestyourself.com. If you have any questions about feedback, we'd love to assist you because we know this is something we've all have to master. So with that, may your next move be your very best move. Talk soon.